They told you the system was fair. They told you the markets were free. They told you your success or failure was your own responsibility. But what if the truth is far more uncomfortable than that? What if the real decisions about your money, your future, and your survival were never in your hands at all? What if, behind the governments you vote for and the institutions you trust, there exists a hidden power system so deeply embedded, so carefully protected, that you were never meant to see it? And every time you struggle, every time you fall behind, that invisible system is quietly collecting the reward? What you're about to hear is not a theory, not a rumor, and not a conspiracy whispered in the dark. This is a documented pattern of how power moves through money, how influence travels through institutions, and how decisions that shape millions of lives are often made far from public eyes. This is a journey into boardrooms that never face elections, into rules that were written for a world you were never invited into, and into a structure designed not for fairness, but for permanence. By the end of this story, you won't just understand who benefits from the system, you'll understand why it keeps surviving. No matter who wins an election, no matter which party is in charge, and no matter how loudly the public demands change. For most of your life, you were taught to believe in visible power. Presidents, Congress, courts, laws. You were taught that these were the forces shaping your world. You were taught that policy debates determined your taxes, your wages, your health care, your education, and your cost of living. And on the surface, it looks that way. Laws pass, budgets are announced, leaders give speeches, and the news cycles move on. But beneath that surface theater, something else is operating, something quieter, something colder, something far more stable than any election cycle. A machine made of institutions, money flows, legal structures, and influence networks that do not change when politicians do. This is the power system you were never meant to see. A system where influence is traded quietly instead of debated publicly. A system where risk is socialized but profit is privatized. A system where failure is punished for the many but rewarded for the few. And the tragedy of it is not just how effective it is, it's how normalized it has become. You've been trained to blame yourself when prices rise faster than your paycheck. You've been trained to accept debt as a lifestyle. You've been trained to see financial stress not as a policy outcome, but as a personal weakness. And all the while, the true architects of the system operate at distances so far removed from everyday pain that they never feel the consequences of their own decisions. This documentary is not about one villain, it's not about one bank, one corporation, or one political party. It's about a pattern. A structure that repeats itself through time, through crises, through booms and collapses, through bailouts and reforms that never quite seem to fix the root of the problem. It's about how rules are written long before you ever feel their impact. It's about how markets are shaped before they ever crash. It's about how inequality is not an accident, but the natural output of a system designed to concentrate control while dispersing blame. And while this system grows stronger, the people living under it grow more fragile. Families stretch thinner each year. Workers running faster just to stand still. Young generations buried under debt before they ever own anything. Retirees watching the value of their lifetime savings erode quietly through inflation and medical costs. And every time the public asks how things became this way, the explanation is always the same. It's complicated, it's global, it's unavoidable. It's just the way the world works now. But that answer is the greatest deception of all. Because the world doesn't just work this way, it was built this way, piece by piece, law by law, crisis by crisis. And the people who built it made sure that most of us would never see more than the surface. They understood something fundamental about power, that control is strongest when it feels invisible, and obedience is easiest when people believe they are free. Tonight we begin pulling back that surface, not with noise, not with hype, but with evidence, patterns, and the quiet truth hidden inside the system itself. You will see how influence replaces democracy, how dependency replaces freedom, how crises become opportunities for consolidation, and how an entire population can be slowly tightened inside an economic structure that rewards a handful while disciplining millions. This is not about fear, this is about clarity, because once you recognize the pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. And once you understand the system, you stop blaming yourself for forces that were never under your control. This is the story of how power truly moves in the modern world, and it begins with the one thing the system can never fully control. The world you were born into looks orderly on the surface. There are flags, parliaments, courtrooms, press conferences, and elections with counting machines and victory speeches. Everything appears structured, visible, and accountable. You're told that power lives in these places, that leaders rise and fall through votes, that laws protect you, that markets reward effort. And for most people, that story becomes reality itself. It becomes the lens through which they understand success, failure, justice, and struggle. But the first illusion of control is believing that what you can see is all that exists. Because real power rarely introduces itself. It doesn't argue in public. It doesn't campaign for approval. It doesn't wear a face you can easily recognize. Real power prefers silence. It prefers complexity. It prefers distance from consequences. You are encouraged to look at the stage while the machinery operates behind it. You are encouraged to debate politicians while policies are shaped elsewhere. You are encouraged to believe that your financial destiny is decided by your choices alone, even while invisible hands tilt the table long before you ever sit down to play. Every day you make decisions you believe are free: where to work, what to buy, how much to borrow, what to invest. But what you're never shown is how narrow the range of those choices truly is. Interest rates rise and fall without your consent. Prices inflate without your vote. Housing becomes unaffordable without your input. Healthcare becomes inaccessible without your permission. And when you ask why, you're given language instead of truth: market forces, global trends, supply chains, fiscal responsibility, necessary austerity, words that explain everything and nothing at the same time. The illusion of control works because it feels personal. If you fall behind, you assume you failed. If you get buried in debt, you assume you mismanaged. If retirement slips further away each year, you assume you didn't plan well enough. The system relies on this internalization of blame, because as long as people blame themselves, they never turn their focus upward. They never question the structure itself. They never ask who designed the rules that everyone else must live under. Visible power absorbs anger. Elections give people targets. Leaders become lightning rods. Outrage gets concentrated on faces that rotate every few years. And each time the public releases its frustration through voting, protests, and debate, the deeper structure remains untouched. The machine doesn't panic when governments change. It adapts, it reorganizes, it waits. Because it was never dependent on any single administration to begin with. And this is the quiet genius of the illusion. People feel represented while being managed. They feel informed while being filtered. They feel free while navigating corridors built long before they arrived. The appearance of choice creates the comfort of control, and comforts are powerful. They keep people calm. They keep people invested. They keep people compliant without ever feeling coerced. But once the illusion cracks, it never fully repairs itself. Once you recognize that the game might be designed rather than fair, every outcome feels different. Every crisis feels less accidental. Every collapse feels less surprising. Every rescue feels more selective. The first step towards seeing the power system is realizing that what you were given was not control, only the appearance of it. Power does not live in a single place. It doesn't sit on one throne, inside one building, or behind one flag. Power moves. It flows. It travels through agreements, balance sheets, legal frameworks, and institutional relationships that were never designed for public understanding. The architecture of invisible power is not a conspiracy hidden in shadows. It is an open system disguised by complexity. And complexity is the perfect camouflage, because most people don't have the time, access, or energy to untangle it. At the center of this architecture are institutions that outlive politicians, banks that survive wars, corporations that endure economic collapses, regulatory bodies that rotate personnel between public office and private boardrooms. These structures create a revolving ecosystem where influence is never lost, only transferred. Laws change, faces change, slogans change, but the direction of benefit stays strangely consistent. Money is the bloodstream of this architecture. Not cash in wallets, but capital that moves faster than borders. Capital that reshapes industries, buys competitors, funds campaigns, underwrites risk, and quietly rewrites the future before the public ever realizes change is coming. When money moves at this level, it doesn't ask permission. It predicts outcomes. It boxes in governments. It disciplines nations. And most importantly, it shields itself from consequence. You are told that institutions exist to stabilize the system, to protect the economy, to ensure fairness. And on paper, that is their purpose. But in practice, these institutions drift toward the interests that feed them. Regulation becomes negotiation. Oversight becomes partnership. Enforcement becomes selective. And the public narrative stays clean while the private incentives grow stronger. Invisible power thrives on insulation. Decision makers do not feel the pain their decisions create. When wages stagnate, they do not tighten their belts. When housing collapses, they do not move into smaller homes. When healthcare becomes inaccessible, they do not ration medicine. Their reality is detached from the consequences of their influence. And when consequence disappears, restraint soon follows. This is how entire systems become misaligned with the people they claim to serve. Policies no longer ask, who does this help? They ask, who does this protect? And protection flows upward. Loss flows downward. Risk is spread across the public. Reward is concentrated at the top. And every time the system bends under pressure, it is reinforced, not reformed. The architecture remains invisible because no single piece looks criminal on its own. A campaign donation here, a regulatory exemption there, a quiet merger, a bailout framed as stability, a revolving door appointment labeled as experience. Each decision is defensible in isolation. But together they form a structure that steadily redistributes power away from the public and toward a shrinking circle of permanent influence. You don't feel this architecture all at once, you feel it gradually, in shrinking opportunity, in rising prices, in disappearing security, in the sense that no matter how fast you run, the finish line keeps moving. This is not chaos, this is design. And this design was never meant to be seen, only felt. Laws are supposed to be society's shield. They're meant to limit abuse, protect the vulnerable, and set boundaries that even the powerful cannot cross. That is the promise people are raised to believe in. But what you're rarely taught is how quietly those laws can be reshaped, softened, redirected, and hollowed out without ever sounding an alarm. Rules don't change through dramatic takeovers. They change through drafts, amendments, exemptions, and fine print that most people will never read and never be told to worry about. The rulebook of the economy is not rewritten in public squares. It evolves in committee rooms, legal workshops, regulatory agencies, and corporate law offices where language is more powerful than guns ever could be. A single sentence added to a bill can shift billions of dollars. A subtle redefinition can erase entire protections. A delayed enforcement can quietly destroy accountability. And almost no one notices until the damage is already baked into everyday life. This is how regulatory capture happens without looking like corruption. The agencies designed to regulate powerful industries slowly become intertwined with them. The same experts who once enforced the rules are recruited to advise the companies being regulated. The same executives rotate into government positions where they now oversee the industries they came from. It's called experience. It's called expertise. It's called efficiency. But what it really creates is alignment of interest between watchdog and subject. And once that happens, the rules stop being barriers. They become coordination tools. Taxes change. Loopholes expand. Enforcement weakens. Penalties become the cost of doing business instead of a deterrent. And each shift is justified with economic language that sounds responsible and unavoidable. Competitiveness, growth, innovation, stability. The words sound neutral, the outcomes are not. What quietly shifts is who pays, who profits, and who is shielded from consequence. For ordinary people, the effects arrive slowly and silently. Public services grow thinner, infrastructure decays, safety nets stretch and tear, wages flatten while productivity climbs, benefits disappear while costs rise, and yet the system is described as working as intended. That statement is more accurate than most realize, just not for the people hearing it. What makes this process so effective is that it never feels like theft. There is no masked figure breaking into the vault. There is only paperwork. There are votes no one watches. There are regulatory delays no one reports. And over time, what once belonged to the public is quietly transferred into private hands with full legal blessing. The law doesn't resist this shift. The law facilitates it. And when outrage finally erupts after a crisis, a collapse, a scandal, we are shown hearings, investigations, and public apologies. We are shown accountability theater. But what we are rarely shown is structural reversal. The same incentives remain, the same relationships remain, the same door keeps revolving, and the rewritten rules stay in place long after public attention moves on. This is how the system protects itself, not through brute force, but through legal engineering, not through open theft, but through authorized extraction. And once you understand that laws themselves can be quietly bent to serve power, you begin to realize that the rules you thought protected you may have already been rewritten against you. The truth does not usually vanish. It is filtered, it is slowed down, it is reframed, it is redirected until it no longer feels like a threat. And this is the quiet role of media inside the power system, not as a single coordinated villain, but as a landscape shaped by ownership, incentives, access, and fear of exclusion. Most people believe control happens through censorship. In reality, it happens through selection. What gets covered decides what the public is allowed to care about. What gets repeated becomes reality. What gets ignored might as well not exist. And the most powerful stories are often buried not because they are false, but because they are dangerous to the structure itself. Corporate wrongdoing becomes complex. Financial manipulation becomes technical. Regulatory failure becomes unfortunate. The language is softened long before the truth ever reaches the public. News organizations depend on access. Access to officials, access to executives, access to briefings, leaks, and inside sources. That access can be quietly revoked. The reporter who pushes too hard suddenly finds doors closed. The outlet that investigates too deeply loses advertising contracts. The editor who insists on uncomfortable questions gets reminded of budgets, shareholders, and reputation. No one has to issue threats. The incentives themselves do the policing. So the public sees fragments instead of structures. A scandal here, a lawsuit there. A fine that sounds large but barely dents a corporation's balance sheet. Each story appears isolated. Each failure looks accidental. Patterns are almost never centered, because once people see patterns, individual excuses stop working. Even outrage is managed. It is allowed to flare, burn hot, and fade quickly. 24-hour news cycles move faster than structural reform ever could. By the time the public fully understands what happened, the narrative has already moved on. The crisis is over. The market is recovering. Confidence must be restored. And restoring confidence in this system always takes priority over restoring justice. Entertainment further blurs the line. Real financial crimes begin to resemble movie plots. Billionaires are turned into characters. Corporate predators become eccentric geniuses. Economic collapse becomes a spectacle, not a reckoning. The suffering of millions is reduced to charts, graphics, and sound bites that never convey the full weight of what's been lost. Meanwhile, people who raise deeper questions are labeled as extreme, too emotional, too political, too disruptive. They are pushed to the edges of discourse where their voices can be dismissed instead of debated. The center remains calm, respectable, and carefully managed. And yet, despite all of this, the truth keeps leaking through whistleblowers, through documents, through lawsuits, through economic outcomes that no amount of narrative control can fully explain away. People feel the truth even if they are never shown it clearly. They feel it in shrinking paychecks, rising rents, disappearing security, and permanent anxiety. The disconnect between official stories and lived reality grows wider each year. The power system does not need to silence everyone. It only needs to delay clarity long enough to secure its position. Because once damage becomes permanent, truth becomes historical, and history, when filtered well enough, can always be rewritten. Control becomes strongest when survival itself is placed on a leash, when people are no longer choosing between comfort and luxury, but between rent and food, between medicine and electricity, between rest and another shift they can barely survive. Economic dependency is not created through one dramatic decision. It is built slowly, quietly, through policies that tighten over decades, until escape no longer feels realistic for most people. Debt is the primary tool, not the kind that builds opportunity, but the kind that traps. Student loans that follow people for life. Medical bills that arrive after moments of vulnerability. Credit cards that fill the gap between wages and the rising cost of living. Mortgages that turn shelter into a decades-long obligation. At first, debt feels like access, then it becomes pressure. Eventually, it becomes identity. When people are buried in obligation, they become predictable. They avoid risk. They tolerate unfair conditions. They accept shrinking returns. They stay in jobs that exhaust them. They delay families. They postpone dreams. Not because they lack ambition, but because the margin for failure has been engineered out of their lives. One missed paycheck becomes a crisis. One illness becomes catastrophe. This is not accidental fragility. This is structural vulnerability. Inflation tightens the trap further, quietly, invisibly. Each year, the same paycheck buys less. Groceries shrink. Rent grows. Insurance premiums climb. Childcare becomes a second mortgage. Retirement drifts further out of reach. And yet, people are told the economy is improving. Markets are up. Profits are strong. Growth is positive. The disconnect is gaslighting at a national scale. Wages stagnate while productivity explodes. People work harder, longer, faster, and with less security than ever before. Temporary contracts replace stable employment. Benefits vanish. Automation increases output while reducing bargaining power. And the narrative never changes. Work harder, upskill, adapt, be flexible. The system demands constant adjustment from workers while offering permanent stability to capital. Dependency becomes generational. Parents pass down financial stress alongside values. Children grow up watching anxiety as a way of life. They enter adulthood already behind, already owing, already conditioned to accept instability as normal. And because they have never known true economic security, they are told it is unrealistic to expect it. This is how control stops feeling like control. It feels like responsibility. It feels like adulthood. It feels like reality. People internalize the pressure. They carry the weight in silence. They blame themselves for outcomes that were structurally engineered. And the system stays clean because the suffering is personalized. You don't need chains when fear of losing everything does the job more efficiently. You don't need force when exhaustion keeps people compliant. You don't need commands when dependency shapes behavior automatically. The strongest systems of control are the ones where people believe they are simply trying to survive, unaware that the structure itself is what made survival so expensive in the first place. Every major crisis is described as a tragedy, a shock, an unforeseen disaster, a rare breakdown in an otherwise stable system. That's the story the public is given. But inside the power structure, crises are seen very differently. They are inflection points. Moments when fear loosens resistance, moments when rules can be suspended, assets can be transferred, and entire markets can be reshaped under the cover of emergency. When everything is calm, people ask questions, they debate, they resist. But when panic spreads, when jobs vanish, savings evaporate, and uncertainty floods daily life, people become desperate for stability. And in desperation, they accept things they never would have agreed to in normal times. This is when power moves fastest. Financial crashes wipe out small investors while the largest institutions are rescued in the name of preventing collapse. Homes are foreclosed at scale, then quietly repurchased by corporate buyers at fractions of their former value. Public wealth is drained to stabilize private failure. And this transfer is not framed as theft. It is framed as necessary, inevitable, responsible. The language of emergency becomes a permission slip. Trillions can be created overnight. Oversight can be suspended. Regulations can be rolled back. Courts can be bypassed. And when the dust settles, the public is left with debt, austerity, and promises of long-term recovery. While consolidation accelerates at the top, disasters follow the same logic. Natural catastrophes, pandemics, supply chain shocks. Each time, ordinary people lose stability while large players gain leverage. Small businesses disappear, gig work expands, labor protections weaken. Surveillance grows, temporary measures quietly become permanent tools of control, and once again the public is told this is the price of safety. Even war fits the pattern. Destruction creates contracts, reconstruction creates profit, defense spending creates fortunes. And the suffering of civilians becomes a statistic buried beneath strategic language and budget lines. The economy adapts, markets adjust. Investors recover long before families bury their dead and rebuild from nothing. What makes this pattern so difficult to challenge is that it operates under moral cover. No one argues against saving the economy. No one protests against emergency response. No one wants collapse. And that instinct, to prevent disaster, is precisely what allows power to reshape the system without consent. The public begs for rescue, and the system answers, but on its own terms. After each crisis, the same promise is made. This time will be different. Regulations will be tightened. Oversight will improve. Accountability will follow. And each time, memory fades faster than structural change. The next emergency arrives. The cycle repeats. And the concentration of power moves one level higher. To the public, each crisis feels like an ending. To the power system, each crisis is a beginning, a reset, a reordering, a chance to lock in new advantages while everyone else is still catching their breath. And by the time recovery is declared, the winners and losers have already been permanently decided. Behind every chart, every economic indicator, every quarterly report, there are human lives absorbing the impact. The system speaks in percentages and projections, but people experience it as loss. Loss of homes, loss of health, loss of time, loss of dignity. And while institutions debate recovery, families are making irreversible decisions in silence. Foreclosure is not just a financial event, it is a psychological fracture. It is the moment a family realizes that years of effort can be erased by a chain of decisions they never participated in. It is children switching schools, parents working multiple jobs, marriages cracking under pressure, and a sense of safety that never fully returns. The system records foreclosure as a statistic. The family records it as a lifetime scar. Medical debt turns illness into punishment. A diagnosis becomes a financial catastrophe layered on top of fear. People delay treatment. They ration medication. They choose between health and solvency. And when they collapse under the weight of both, the system bills them for the privilege of falling apart. To power, it is healthcare financing. To the patient, it is a quiet sentence of anxiety that never expires. Job loss is framed as transition, upskilling, mobility. But the lived reality is panic at 2 a.m, scrolling through applications that never reply. It is identity dissolving alongside income. It is the constant humiliation of explaining gaps to employers who benefit from desperation. The market calls this efficiency. People feel it as erasure. Communities hollow out slowly, stores close, schools lose funding, hospitals consolidate, public spaces decay. Crime rises not from evil, but from scarcity. Addiction fills the vacuum left by vanishing stability. And while politicians visit during election seasons with speeches and promises, the structural forces that created the collapse remain untouched. The emotional cost is rarely counted. Chronic stress shortens lives. Anxiety becomes normal. Depression becomes routine. People normalize panic the way previous generations normalized fatigue. Children absorb this tension without understanding its source, and they grow up carrying a pressure they never chose. What makes this suffering so corrosive is not just its scale, but its invisibility. Individual failures are broadcast. Structural violence is abstract. People compare their pain to others and conclude they must not be trying hard enough. The system never has to defend itself because the victims defend it for them, through shame. And still, people endure. They care for parents they can't afford to lose. They raise children in shrinking apartments. They show up to jobs that drain their bodies and spirits. They keep the entire structure standing while bearing the least reward from it. Their resilience is praised. Their exploitation is never named. The system does not measure the cost of this endurance, it only measures output, and as long as people keep surviving quietly, the machine interprets that survival as consent. The pattern survives because it was designed to, not as a single plot written by one mind, but as an evolving system that learns, adapts, and hardens with every challenge it survives. Each time the public grows angry, the system studies the reaction. Each time reform is demanded, the system reshapes just enough to appear responsive while keeping its core intact. This is not failure repeating itself. This is a structure refining its own defenses. Every cycle begins with excess, easy money, expanding credit, rising markets, optimism fueled by leverage instead of stability. Then pressure builds quietly beneath the surface. Risk multiplies where few are watching. Warnings are ignored because growth is profitable. And when the structure finally cracks under its own weight, collapse is framed as surprise, shock, once-in-a-generation failure. The public absorbs the panic. The system absorbs the opportunity. After collapse comes a rescue, bailouts, stimulus, emergency powers. The language is always urgent. Action must be immediate. Debate must wait. And in that narrow window of fear, permanent changes are made under temporary banners. Power consolidates under the promise of stabilization. When the crisis fades, the new hierarchy remains. Then comes the narrative reset. The story shifts from what caused the collapse to how bravely the system responded. Attention moves from accountability to recovery. The same institutions that created the damage rebrand themselves as the solution. The same architects of failure become the managers of reform. The public is invited to move forward, not to look back. Outrage fades, fatigue sets in, life resumes under new constraints that soon feel familiar. The memory of collapse becomes abstract. A lesson learned, a chapter closed, and the cycle quietly restarts, more concentrated, more insulated, more prepared for the next rupture. What makes the cycle nearly unbreakable is that it feeds on human limits. People cannot live in constant resistance. They have bills to pay, children to raise, bodies that grow tired. The system understands this. It does not need universal approval. It only needs long enough stretches of exhaustion to prevent collective focus. Reform becomes symbolic. Committees form, reports are written, a few individuals are sacrificed publicly to preserve the legitimacy of the whole. The structure remains untouched because dismantling it would require confronting how deeply it is embedded into everyday survival. And so the cycle continues not because no one sees it, but because seeing it is not the same as escaping it. People recognize the pattern. They discuss it. They warn each other. But recognition alone does not change who controls the levers. The system does not need to win forever. It only needs to avoid losing all at once. And by breaking resistance into years, into distractions, into recoveries followed by new crises, it ensures that no single moment ever becomes large enough to truly threaten it. This is how the pattern never breaks. It learns from every strike against it. It absorbs every shock. And it grows stronger, not in spite of pressure, but because of it. The final truth is not hidden in a secret room. It's hidden in plain sight, scattered across laws, markets, crises, and everyday struggles so familiar that they no longer feel connected. The reveal is this: there is no single villain at the center of the system. There is no mastermind pulling every string. What exists instead is something far more dangerous, a self-sustaining mechanism of power that no longer needs intention to continue doing harm. This is what most people never realize. The system does not run on corruption alone. It runs on incentives. On structures that reward extraction over protection, concentration over balance, and survival at the top over stability at the bottom. Even when individuals change, the logic of the machine remains. New leaders enter with promises of reform and leave bound by the same pressures that shaped their predecessors. Those who resist are isolated. Those who adapt are promoted. And little by little, the system selects for the kind of people who will never threaten it. This is why scandals never end the cycle. This is why outrage never leads to structural reversal. This is why every once-in-a-lifetime collapse somehow happens again within a generation. Because the true engine of the system is not greed alone. It is design, a design that converts public suffering into private leverage and private failure into public obligation. The biggest illusion you were given is that this system is chaotic, that it is broken, that it is mismanaged. In reality, it is functioning with brutal efficiency. It does exactly what it was built to do: move risk downward, move profit upward, and maintain just enough stability to avoid total rebellion. It is not designed to create prosperity for everyone. It is designed to prevent collapse while preserving hierarchy. And here's the hardest truth to accept. You participate in this system not because you approve of it, but because you are trapped inside it. You work within it, you borrow within it, you consume within it, you vote within it, you survive within it. There is no clean exit. There is only awareness and pressure. The real power of this system was never in secrecy alone. It was in normalizing conditions that should have felt unacceptable. It taught people to accept permanent insecurity as adult responsibility. It taught them to see survival as personal success. It taught them to chase stability inside a structure built on instability. And when people stop expecting justice, the system no longer has to defend its absence. This is the pattern you were never meant to see, not because it was perfectly hidden, but because once you see it clearly, the stories you were told your whole life can never fully hold again. You stop asking why individual decisions feel unfair, and start asking why unfairness itself feels permanent. This is the moment where the surface explanations fall apart, and what remains is not comfort, but clarity. What you've seen through this story is not a theory about power, but a map of how it behaves when it is left to grow without consequence. A system that no longer needs corruption to function, because its structure itself produces the same result, where responsibility flows downward, while protection flows up, where survival is framed as personal strength, even when the pressure crushing people is institutional. This is why the struggle so many feel today is not isolated. It is shared. It is patterned. It is repeated across cities, across generations, across industries. Different lives, same design. And as long as that design remains untouched, the outcomes will keep returning no matter who is in office, no matter what promises are made, and no matter how loudly reform is announced. But awareness changes the relationship. When people stop blaming themselves for engineered outcomes, the narrative weakens. When they stop accepting permanent insecurity as normal, the system loses one of its greatest shields: silence. Clarity does not instantly dismantle power, but it strips away its most powerful disguise: inevitability. This story is not meant to leave you hopeless. It is meant to leave you alert. Because the greatest strength of any system built on imbalance is the belief that nothing else is possible. And the most dangerous idea to that kind of power is a population that understands the pattern well enough to stop mistaking it for fate. The system survives on invisibility. and visibility is where its real vulnerability begins. In the end, the power system was never hidden behind walls or locked in secret rooms. It lived in laws that felt distant, markets that felt natural, and struggles that felt personal. It survived not because no one questioned it, but because most people were never shown the full shape of it at once. And once you finally see the pattern, the world does not look the same again. The system doesn't disappear, but neither does the truth. If this investigation changed the way you see the system around you, make sure you support the work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share it with someone who still believes the struggle is only personal, not structural. And in the comments, tell us which part of the pattern opened your eyes the most. Stay connected to Corruption Rewind, because there are more power systems waiting to be exposed.